From the perspective of a criminal investigator, the evening of May 3rd, 2007 is not viewed as a mystery that arose from nowhere, but rather as the culmination of a chain of decisions that created a textbook scenario of vulnerability plus opportunity. Tragedies are rarely the product of a single dramatic event. They are typically the outcome of pre-existing weaknesses exploited by chance or design. On that night, the vulnerability was written into every detail of the arrangements for the McCann children. Madeleine, then nearly 4 years old, and her younger twin siblings, Sean and Amelie, were left in apartment 5A, a holiday unit that conveyed an appearance of safety but lacked any genuine real-time security. An investigator's primary axiom is that feelings do not equal reality, and the perception of a safe environment is often the first layer of a false sense of security that must be stripped away. Rather than using the resort's formal babysitting service, Jerry and Kate McCann and their friends opted for a self-managed checking routine, with parents periodically leaving their dinner at the tapas bar to check on their respective children. This system raises a critical question about risk perception. How does a routine, however flawed, create a powerful but false sense of control? An investigator must conclude that a child is not safe because an adult intends to check on them every 30 minutes. A child is safe only when an adult is physically present and able to intervene. The apartment's physical state compounded this vulnerability. The rear patio door was left partially open, a detail that, to a professional, is not trivial, but is instead a clear signal that the boundary between the private interior and the public exterior has been compromised. Before we analyze the suspicions in the case, please let me know where you saw this video. I will read it all and spread it around the world. And don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel to be the first to receive notifications when there are new videos. A critical weakness in the timeline is that no independent witness confirmed seeing Madeleine in her bed after she was initially put down for the night. Checks were reportedly cursory, sometimes consisting of merely listening at the bedroom door rather than entering. This gap in confirmed knowledge is a crucial point of failure in any investigation. How can a definitive timeline be established when the victim's presence is based on assumption rather than direct observation? It is in this void of certainty that the truth can vanish. While avoiding moral condemnation, any objective procedural analysis must conclude that leaving 3 children under the age of 5 alone was a fundamental error in judgment. It was the pivotal decision from which every subsequent possibility, be it abduction, accident, or wandering, became imaginable. A key investigative signpost emerged from Madeleine's own words on the morning of her disappearance. She reportedly told her parents she had woken the previous night and wondered where they were. This is not just a poignant anecdote, it is evidence. It demonstrates her awareness that her parents were absent and that reaching them required leaving the apartment. This presents a pivotal divergence in the possible chain of events. Does this evidence point more strongly towards an abduction from within the apartment, or to a scenario where the child herself initiated the sequence of events by wandering out into the public domain, where predators thrive? This latter possibility aligns more closely with statistical data. A sophisticated stranger abduction from a child's private residence is an exceptionally rare event. Far more common is an opportunistic crime that occurs when a child, even for a moment, enters an unsupervised public or semi-public space. Therefore, an analytical reconstruction of that night is not shaped by the actions of a criminal genius, but by routine human decisions that introduced avoidable risk. The access was provided by the open door. The opportunity was provided by the absence of adult supervision. The decision to leave the children unattended was the hinge upon which all else turned. This forces a difficult public and professional conversation. Where does the responsibility of an individual's personal decisions end, and where does the unforeseen, opportunistic act of a criminal begin? The tragedy of May 3rd was not inevitable, but it was made possible by a perfect storm created by an empty apartment, an open door, and the absence of guardianship. An experienced investigator arriving in Praia da Luz, 72 hours after Madeleine McCann's disappearance, would have been confronted not with a controlled investigation, but with a scene of chaos. The small resort town had already become a circus of onlookers, media, and well-intentioned but misguided helpers. For any detective, this initial impression is telling. It signifies that the most valuable window of opportunity, the golden hours when forensic traces are fresh and witness memories are sharpest, has been irrevocably lost. From the moment the alarm was raised, the McCann's apartment 5A should have been treated as a major crime scene and hermetically sealed. Instead, friends, resort staff, and others had moved through the space, searching under beds and lifting mattresses, inadvertently erasing the very trace evidence that could have provided a definitive lead. This raises a fundamental question of procedural priority. In the initial moments of a crisis, how can the human impulse to do something be balanced against the critical, counterintuitive need to do nothing and preserve the scene? This breakdown stemmed from a failure in core policing discipline. Local officers, evidently unaccustomed to major crime, treated the report as a routine missing child case, not the potential stranger abduction it should have been considered from the outset. No effective cordon was established, and the scene was allowed to become polluted beyond reliable forensic use by the time senior Polizia Judiciaria investigators arrived. This was compounded by a failure to conduct systematic house-to-house inquiries in a transient holiday community where potential witnesses would soon disperse across Europe. The chance to identify a loitering stranger, an unusual vehicle, or a crucial observation was squandered because too many doors remained unopened. Furthermore, the initial public appeals were catastrophically vague. A detailed description of Madeleine, including her distinctive eye defect, was not immediately circulated, rendering the public ineffective as the eyes and ears of the investigation. The management of the international media was equally flawed, highlighting the delicate relationship between law enforcement and the press. The first press conference was a disaster of communication, conducted in Portuguese with no clear information, projecting an image of arrogance and incompetence that bred mistrust rather than cooperation. Public communication is not window dressing. It is a vital investigative tool for generating tips and maintaining confidence. These cumulative failures meant the golden 48 hours were squandered, leaving investigators with a puzzle where half the pieces had been brushed off the table. The case was forced to proceed on speculation instead of data. This leads to a difficult but essential point of reflection. To what extent can an investigation ever recover from such a catastrophic loss of evidence and opportunity in its opening stages? It is plausible that the truth was not hidden, but simply erased within those first chaotic days, leaving behind only the enduring image of a faceless predator. An image stamped onto headlines because the hard evidence that might have proven or disproven it was lost forever. From a seasoned investigator's perspective, the dominant narrative of a sophisticated intruder penetrating a private apartment to abduct a child has always seemed statistically improbable. Such events are extraordinarily rare globally and virtually unheard of in the United Kingdom. A far more common and forensically consistent scenario is that of a child waking, wandering, and being opportunistically taken during a brief moment of exposure. This forms the basis of an alternative central hypothesis, and its crucial piece of evidence comes not from speculation, but from Madeleine McCann's own words. On the morning of the day she disappeared, she asked her parents why they had not come to her when she and her siblings were crying the previous night. This seemingly small exchange is of immense investigative weight. It demonstrates two vital facts. First, that Madeleine had a history of waking in the night and seeking her parents, and second, that she now understood exactly where they could be found, at the tapas bar, a short walk from the apartment. This awareness is transformative. If Madeleine woke again on the night of May the 3rd, It is entirely logical that she might attempt to repeat the search, this time knowing her destination. A nearly 4-year-old child is capable of such decisive action. To understand the risk, one must picture the resort's geography. From the back patio of the McCann's apartment, a short 40-yard walk along a public footpath was all that separated her from the area of the tapas bar. This short distance, however, represents a critical shift in environment. Inside the apartment, she was relatively safe. Outside, on a public path at night, she became tragically visible and vulnerable. Here, a predator did not need to breach an apartment. They only needed to be in the right place at the right time. This theory pivots the investigation away from a premeditated break-in towards a crime of opportunity. What does this shift in focus mean for the profile of a potential suspect? While this hypothesis may seem too simple compared to the dark myth of a masked intruder, its pattern is chillingly familiar. The 2000 abduction of Sarah Payne in West Sussex occurred in the 20 seconds she was momentarily separated from her family. The perpetrator, Roy Whiting, had not targeted her specifically. He was an opportunistic predator who seized the moment she became exposed. Similarly, the 1978 disappearance of Jeanette Tate in Devon happened in the few seconds she cycled out of her friend's sight. The speed and opportunism are the hallmarks of these crimes. These tragic precedents force a difficult re-evaluation of public spaces. How can we reconcile the need for children's independence with the reality that a devastating crime can occur in a matter of seconds? Madeleine's morning comment places her squarely in the category of children who, by seeking a parent, could expose themselves to precisely this kind of danger. This leads to a final, chilling question. Is the public narrative of a sophisticated, shadowy intruder more comforting than the mundane and statistically more probable reality of an opportunistic predator encountering a child in a moment of extreme vulnerability? Holiday resorts are transient environments where strangers move without scrutiny, creating a fertile ground for opportunists. An offender did not need to be staking out apartment 5A for weeks. They needed only to be in the vicinity, motivated and waiting for a moment of vulnerability. This hypothesis, that Madeleine McCann woke, wandered out to find her parents, and was taken in that brief interval, is not presented as proven fact. However, when weighing probabilities and criminological experience, it aligns far more closely with the available evidence than the alternative. It is consistent with Madeleine's own words, the resort's geography, and the established patterns of opportunistic child abduction seen in cases like those of Sarah Payne and Jeanette Tate. This forces a choice between two competing narratives: the high-risk, statistically rare premeditated intrusion, or the low-risk, opportunistic crime that aligns with established criminal behavior. Which scenario is more grounded in investigative reality? While this external threat remains the most credible scenario from a procedural standpoint, police are trained to begin any missing child investigation with those closest to the victim. This is a statistically sound principle. In the McCann case, however, the way suspicion turned inward was neither measured nor evidence-driven. It was shaped by public perception and the unbearable glare of the media. Jerry and Kate McCann quickly became the focus of suspicion, not because of clear forensic evidence, but because their public response to the trauma did not align with expectations. This brings into focus a critical aspect of modern crime. How does intense, 24-hour media scrutiny impact the emotional state of victims and, in turn, the public's perception of their credibility? Every expression was analyzed. Kate McCann playing tennis was interpreted as cold detachment. Jerry McCann's calm, clinical demeanor in press conferences was portrayed as suspicious composure. The public demand to see a specific performance of grief, constant, visible sobbing, is a dangerous trap. An experienced investigator knows there is no correct way to react to trauma. Some individuals become frantic, while others become withdrawn and analytical. An emotional display is not evidence of innocence, nor is composure evidence of guilt. The suspicion around Kate was particularly cruel, with her attachment to Madeleine's cuddle cat toy being dismissed as a staged emotional prop. Jerry's controlled tone, a quality praised in his profession as a surgeon, was reframed as calculation. This phenomenon raises a profound question. At what point does public empathy curdle into judgment? And how can an investigation remain objective when faced with such intense external pressure? In truth, the McCanns were parents navigating an unimaginable crisis. Yet their behavior was judged against a fictional script of perfect victimhood, a scrutiny that was at least partly fueled by the Portuguese investigation itself. Once the Portuguese Polícia Judiciária shifted its focus towards Jerry and Kate McCann, leaks to the press began to frame them as prime suspects. The lead investigator, Gonçalo Amaral, even published a book advancing the theory that Madeleine had died in the apartment in an accident and that her parents had concealed her death. This narrative, however unsubstantiated, gained traction because it satisfied a public appetite for blame. The McCanns' own public statements sometimes exacerbated the situation. Their admission that many parents on holiday do the same when leaving children unattended was perceived not as a contextual explanation, but as a dismissive attempt to minimize responsibility, alienating potential sympathizers. This highlights a critical divide between legal and public judgment. While the law requires evidence to bridge the gap from negligence to homicide, where does public opinion draw that line? And is it influenced more by facts or by emotion? An investigator must separate emotional judgments from established facts. The fact is that the McCanns made a fundamental error that created the environment for Madeleine's disappearance. The fact is also that no credible, conclusive evidence has ever been presented to prove they were involved in her death or a subsequent cover-up. Suspicion based on how a person performs grief is not evidence. It is bias. In Portugal, this fixation on the parents diverted crucial resources and delayed other lines of inquiry, creating an adversarial atmosphere. From a professional standpoint, their behavior under unimaginable stress is not proof of guilt, but of humanity under siege. The suspicion settled upon them not because of hard evidence, but because of the vacuum created by the initial investigative failures. In that void, it is often easier to blame the visible targets than to grapple with the specter of an uncaught predator. Ultimately, an investigator must return to the guiding principle that appearance is not evidence. What can be proven is simply this: a child was left unattended, a door was unsecured, and a predator found an opportunity. Everything else is noise. Into this evidential vacuum, however, one element of forensic science was introduced that seemed to offer a path through the noise: the work of specialist sniffer dogs. For those who suspected the parents, the alerts from these dogs were the smoking gun. For a forensic analyst, however, they represent an ambiguous and highly controversial piece of the puzzle. The introduction of this evidence raises a crucial question about its interpretation. When does a scientific tool provide a definitive answer, and when does it merely provide ambiguous data that can be used to support pre-existing biases? In July 2007, two highly trained English Springer Spaniels were brought to Portugal. A cadaver dog, trained to detect the scent of human decomposition, and a blood detection dog. These dogs alerted in two key locations: inside the McCanns' holiday apartment and in the boot of a car the family hired several weeks after Madeleine had vanished. The alerts from the specialist dogs were seized upon as proof that Madeleine McCann had died in the apartment and her body later transported in a hire car. On the surface, it was a compelling narrative. However, from an investigative standpoint, the primary question must be, how reliable are such alerts, and what do they prove in isolation? In the British legal system, dog alert evidence is never considered sufficient for a conviction on its own. It must be corroborated by physical forensic findings such as DNA or fibers. In the McCann case, no such corroboration was ever established, Without this, the alerts remain mere indications, not conclusions. This illustrates a critical danger in any investigation. How easily can an ambiguous piece of data, like a dog alert, be elevated to the status of proof when it fits a simple and compelling narrative? This uncorroborated evidence became the cornerstone of the theory advanced by the lead Portuguese detective Gonçalo Amaral, most famously in his book, The Truth of the Lie. He argued that Madeleine had died in an accident in the apartment and her parents, fearing the consequences of negligence, staged an abduction and concealed the body. This theory offered a simple, if brutal, explanation that satisfied a public appetite for blame. However, when subjected to scrutiny, the theory crumbles. Firstly, there was no physical evidence, such as blood, hair, or other signs of trauma, in the apartment consistent with a fatal fall. Secondly, the psychological premise is profoundly illogical. It is exceptionally rare for parents, even those guilty of negligence, to risk a complex cover-up of an accidental death rather than calling for help. Finally, the timeline regarding the hire car collapses under logistical analysis. By the time the McCanns rented the vehicle, they were under constant and intense police and media surveillance. The idea that they could have secretly retrieved, stored, and transported a body without detection defies all logic. This raises a question about investigative bias. When faced with a lack of evidence for an external perpetrator, is there a tendency to construct an internal theory, even if it defies logical and psychological probability? The fallibility of the dog alerts themselves, the potential for cross-contamination in a high-traffic rental apartment and vehicle, further weakens the foundation of this theory. The most damaging consequence of this fixation was the diversion of investigative resources away from external leads. The leap from the McCanns' admitted negligence to a calculated concealment of a corpse is a canyon of missing evidence, a leap made not by facts, but by frustration. Ultimately, this forces us to distinguish between a plausible narrative and an evidence-based conclusion. How much damage is done to the pursuit of justice when an official investigation becomes fixated on a theory that provides a satisfying explanation for public anger, but lacks a solid factual foundation? From a professional standpoint, the conclusion that Jerry and Kate McCann orchestrated a deception is implausible in the extreme. The judgment that they were flawed parents who made a grave mistake, but not killers, is based not on sympathy or naivety, but on the rigorous standards of investigation that demand evidence over assumption. The cadaver dog alerts remain an interesting but uncorroborated footnote, and the Amaral theory stands as a cautionary tale of how bias can warp an investigation. The professional assessment, after years of examining the case, must be that Madeleine was not killed by her parents. She was taken as a direct consequence of the vulnerability created when she was left alone. This leads to the final investigative judgment. Should the focus remain on the unproven and logically flawed theory of a family conspiracy, or return to the foundational facts of the case? Every high-profile investigation attracts peripheral characters, and none illustrates this more starkly than Robert Murat. His ordeal demonstrates how quickly an odd suspect can be created when police uncertainty combines with a media frenzy. Murat was a British expatriate living near apartment 5A who offered his fluent Portuguese to assist the police as a translator. Very quickly, however, his eagerness to be present was misinterpreted as suspicious. He became the archetypal odd suspect, a man who lived with his mother, was recently separated, and seemed socially awkward. This raises a recurring question. Why, in the absence of hard evidence, do investigations and the public so often gravitate towards individuals who simply do not conform to expected social norms? This suspicion, amplified by journalists, seeped into the official inquiry, and Murat was soon formally declared an arguido, or suspect. This is a depressingly familiar pattern. When evidence is thin, attention drifts toward individuals who appear unusual. The British media played a catastrophic role, casting Murat as the likely abductor in sensational headlines. Proof was not the goal. newspaper sales were. In this crucible of public outrage, he became a character in a crime drama, not a real person whose life was being dismantled. Police searches of his home and property yielded nothing. No forensic link, no eyewitness testimony, and no credible evidence connecting him to Madeleine's disappearance. Eventually, the truth prevailed. Murat was cleared of all involvement and won substantial libel damages from several newspapers that had vilified him. But his ordeal is a profound cautionary lesson. He was turned into a scapegoat because police, under immense pressure, latched onto a convenient figure, and the media amplified that suspicion until it was accepted as truth. His case forces a critical examination of the relationship between police and the press. When an official investigation and sensationalist media narratives begin to reinforce each other, how can an innocent individual protect themselves from being convicted in the court of public opinion? The creation of a scapegoat provides the illusion of progress, but if a suspect is chosen based on perceived oddness rather than evidence, the investigation stalls in the worst possible way. The case of Robert Murat serves as a stark reminder of this fundamental investigative principle. Eccentricity is not criminality. His ordeal stands as a parallel tragedy to Madeleine's disappearance, with both outcomes stemming from the same root of investigative failure compounded by media recklessness. It forces a critical question. At what point does focusing on a person of interest based on behavioral quirks rather than evidence become a form of institutional negligence? In recent years, one name has dominated the narrative: Christian Brueckner, a convicted German offender. The German prosecutor, Hans Christian Wolters, has repeatedly and with remarkable confidence declared him to be the man who killed Madeleine. Brueckner's chilling criminal history, a drifter and pedophile who was in Portugal at the time, seemed to fit the profile perfectly. This highlights a common tension in criminal profiling. How much weight should be given to a suspect's past behavior, and how do investigators avoid the trap of confirmation bias, where a compelling history is mistaken for proof in a new case? For years, German authorities have promised imminent charges, yet none have been filed. The cornerstone of the German case rests on mobile phone cell site data, which allegedly placed Brueckner near the McCann's apartment. However, a detailed analysis of this evidence reveals critical weaknesses. Independent telecommunications experts have demonstrated that not only did the phone number in question likely not belong to Brueckner, but the cell tower's coverage area was several kilometers wide, making it impossible to pinpoint a user's location to the specific crime scene. Without this central piece of evidence, the case collapses. To present this as proof of guilt is not only misleading, it is dangerous. This situation raises a crucial question about the ethics of public prosecution. When a prosecutor repeatedly declares a suspect's guilt in the media without filing formal charges, does it serve the cause of justice, or does it create a trial by public opinion that undermines the legal process? It must be stated clearly: Christian Brueckner is a dangerous criminal who belongs in prison for the crimes he has committed. But being a vile individual does not automatically make him the abductor of Madeleine McCann. Guilt for this specific crime cannot be established by character alone. It must be proven with facts and corroboration. The public declarations of certainty may satisfy a demand for answers and offer the McCanns a false hope of closure, but they do not bring us closer to the truth. Until credible evidence is presented in a court of law, the German case remains little more than conjecture that only muddies the waters of an already complex investigation. The danger of focusing so heavily on Christian Brueckner without definitive proof is twofold. Firstly, it risks a profound miscarriage of justice, potentially convicting a man not on evidence, but on reputation and past crimes. Such an outcome would serve neither Madeleine McCann, her family, nor the fundamental principles of law. Is it ever acceptable to build a case on probability rather than proof, especially when a child's justice is at stake? Secondly, this intense focus risks letting the real perpetrator, if it is someone else, slip further into the shadows. If Brueckner is not the abductor, then every year spent insisting he is amounts to wasted time, lost opportunities, and neglected leads. The true offender, if still alive, remains at liberty, unchallenged and unpunished. Having worked closely with the FBI and studied countless child abduction cases, one of the hard truths is that offenders often strike in moments of opportunity, then disappear back into anonymity. They may not be lifelong predators with thick criminal records. Sometimes they are opportunists who act once and never again. By pinning the case solely on Brueckner, might investigators be blinding themselves to the possibility of another offender, someone less obvious, someone who slipped through the cracks during those chaotic early days in Praia da Luz? This is why caution is so crucial. As investigators, one must resist the seduction of the convenient suspect. Yes, Christian Brueckner is a convicted pedophile. Yes, he lived in Portugal. Yes, he has committed monstrous acts. But does any of that prove he took Madeleine McCann? To conflate suspicion with certainty is to betray the very standards of justice we claim to uphold. After more than 16 years studying this case, interviewing witnesses, reviewing files, and retracing events on the ground, the conclusion remains consistent. Madeleine likely woke, wandered out of the apartment, and was taken by an opportunistic predator. Whether that predator was Brueckner or someone else must be determined by evidence, not by proclamation. And to date, the evidence does not point conclusively to him. The German-led focus on Brueckner illustrates one of the greatest dangers in any investigation: the temptation to declare victory before the case is truly solved. Prosecutors want closure, the media wants headlines, and the public wants certainty, but justice cannot be built on desire. It must be built on fact. Until that happens, Madeleine's case remains unresolved, and every day of potential misdirection only deepens the tragedy. The principle should be simple. If you have the evidence, bring charges. If you do not, stop speaking as though you do. Because in the gap between those two positions lies the credibility of the entire investigation and the possibility of justice for Madeleine. Anything less is not justice at all. After 16 years of examining the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, weighing every piece of evidence and every competing theory, the analysis returns to the same conclusion reached long ago. Madeleine most likely woke in the night, remembered where her parents, Jerry and Kate McCann, were, and set out to find them. In doing so, she left the relative security of apartment 5A and stepped into a public space. At that moment, she became visible, vulnerable, and tragically accessible to anyone who might be waiting or watching. In professional judgment, this scenario remains the most plausible explanation for what happened. This is not a conclusion reached lightly. It is grounded in patterns studied across hundreds of child abduction cases. The FBI has long established that in the overwhelming majority of cases where a child is abducted by a stranger, the outcome is fatal within the first 72 hours. If Madeleine was taken, as is believed, then the chances are that she died very soon afterward. This is a grim truth, but one we must face. Does the absence of credible sightings in the years since, despite unprecedented global attention, lend weight to this harrowing timeline? Another important factor is the digital age we now live in. In other cases of child exploitation, images and videos often surface on the dark web, traded among offenders sometimes years after the crimes. In all the research and intelligence gathered by law enforcement worldwide, no such material involving Madeleine has ever appeared. If she had been trafficked or exploited in that way, the probability of some digital trace emerging is high. The fact that nothing has surfaced strongly suggests that she was not kept alive for such purposes. Instead, the evidence aligns with the conclusion that she died early in the course of her abduction. Then comes the question of disposal. If Madeleine was killed, where did her abductor leave her? This is perhaps the most painful element to consider. The landscape around Praia da Luz offered many possibilities, but the sea, only a short distance from the resort, presents itself as the most likely. The ocean has long been described by investigators as the perfect keeper of secrets. Bodies disposed of in the sea are rarely recovered, particularly when currents and tides are strong. In the first days after Madeleine's disappearance, when search efforts were chaotic and poorly coordinated, the opportunity for an offender to use the sea would have been real. Once consigned to the water, the chances of recovery diminished to almost nothing. Some find this conclusion unsatisfactory because it does not end with an arrest, a confession, or a trial. But are investigations about satisfying public desire for a neat conclusion, or are they about following evidence where it leads, no matter how bleak the destination? The evidence, as sparse as it is, points toward a simple, tragic narrative. A young child woke, wandered, and crossed paths with a predator. No elaborate conspiracy, no complex cover-up, just vulnerability, opportunity, and the terrible presence of someone prepared to exploit both. It is also unequivocal that for years, suspicion has swirled around Jerry and Kate McCann. Every accusation has been heard that they staged an abduction, that they hid a body, that they lied about the night's events. Yet none of these accusations are supported by hard evidence. Their greatest mistake was leaving their children unattended, a mistake for which they will pay a lifelong price. But it is crucial to distinguish negligence from malice, and that confusion has poisoned the case for too long. Experience shows that when investigators fixate on the wrong theory, the real offender slips further into obscurity. That has been the danger with both the Portuguese fixation on the parents and the German fixation on Christian Brueckner. Both paths, it can be argued, are distractions from the more straightforward explanation. The truth likely lies not in complex conspiracies or high-profile suspects, but in the opportunistic actions of a predator who happened to be in the right place at the wrong time. This conclusion leaves many questions unanswered. We may never know the identity of the abductor. We may never recover Madeleine's remains. We may never have the courtroom moment of justice that so many long for. But investigations must deal in probabilities, not possibilities. And the probability after all these years of study is that Madeleine died within days, if not hours, of her disappearance. This is not the end of a theorist, but of an investigator who has spent nearly 2 decades immersed in this case, having walked the streets of Praia da Luz, studied the files, spoken to witnesses, and compared the patterns with countless other cases. The belief remains steady. Madeleine woke up and walked out in search of her parents. Out there, in the short stretch of road between her apartment and the tapas bar, a predatory pedophile was waiting. In a matter of seconds, opportunity and vulnerability collided, and she was gone. That is, in professional judgment, where the truth likely lies. When one steps back from every theory, every headline, and every piece of contested evidence, one truth remains. A small child disappeared in the span of minutes, and nearly 2 decades later, the world still does not know where she is. The weight of that silence tells us more than speculation ever can. Madeleine's case is no longer just about a family or a seaside town in Portugal. It has become a mirror reflecting how fragile our systems are when discipline, preparation, and clear thinking are absent at the moment they are most needed. The first lesson is about vulnerability. Children are resilient, curious, and determined, but they are defenseless in the presence of danger. Leaving them alone, even in a place that feels safe, creates a space where tragedy can take root. The McCanns made a decision they believed was ordinary. In reality, it was the hinge on which everything else turned. That mistake does not prove guilt, but it does prove how easily trust in safety can collapse into catastrophe. The second lesson is about investigation. From the first chaotic hours in Praia da Luz, opportunities were lost forever. The scene was contaminated, neighbors were not questioned systematically, and clarity was replaced by rumor. Every case shows that discipline in the opening moments defines whether justice is possible. Here, discipline failed. What should have been a search for evidence became a chase after theories, and theories harden quickly into bias. Once bias enters, truth recedes. The third lesson is about society. For all these years, the McCanns have lived under a cloud of suspicion, attacked for how they grieved, for what they said, even for how they looked in photographs. Has the public's demand for answers found an easier target in the parents than in the faceless predator who may never be caught? This is the cruelty of perception. It is easier to condemn those we can see than to pursue the one who remains hidden. And yet, the search for Madeleine has shaped how the world now responds to missing children. Resorts advertise improved security. Police forces review their protocols, and families everywhere think twice before assuming that proximity equals protection. These are hard lessons purchased at a terrible price, but they are lessons nonetheless. For many, the most plausible explanation remains simple and devastating. Madeleine likely woke, sought her parents, and crossed a short stretch of road into the public domain. There, opportunity met predation, and she was lost. No conspiracy, no master plan, only seconds of exposure that changed everything. What endures is not certainty, but responsibility. A responsibility to protect children before danger arrives, a responsibility to preserve evidence with discipline, and a responsibility to resist the seduction of convenient blame. Justice may never come in the form of an arrest or a courtroom verdict, but justice also means refusing to forget, refusing to distort, and refusing to accept delusion in place of truth. That is the only way Madeleine's story can serve more than sorrow. After nearly 2 decades of headlines, theories, and heartbreak, the silence surrounding Madeleine's fate remains unbroken. How has this unending mystery shaped your own perspective on justice, safety, and the stories we choose to believe? When faced with such profound uncertainty, do you find solace in the simplest, most tragic explanation, or does a part of you hold out for a truth yet to be uncovered? What responsibility do we, the public who have watched this story unfold, now carry for Madeleine's memory? Thanks for watching. How do you feel about these arguments and theories? Does it give you a different perspective on the case? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to receive the latest notifications.